right, now let's do some fan questions.
Hey Chael, what's up? Since you're a movies fan, I have a question. Of all the UFC fighters in history, who do you think has the most compelling story to be told in a movie?
Well, for an interesting story, many of the stories have been told, and many fighter stories are essentially the same, right? Maybe they were bullied as a youth, or maybe they just aspired. They saw some guys on TV, and this is what I want to go into. But generally, you do hear the same story. For boxers and MMA guys, it's usually about getting out, whether it was to get out of the community, to get out of a bad life, to get out of a bad situation. But many of the stories really sound similar. And it generally has to do with, little extra energy. The Anthony Smith, by example. Anthony Smith's story is a great story, but it's also just one that you hear over and over again. You got this troubled kid causing problems around town, had a little extra energy, decided to put that energy in a positive direction, stumbled into a gym one day, got great aspirations, came back to the gym the next day, and ended up making a career out of it. But you do hear those stories. They seem to be very common. I will tell you, if you're going to go make a movie on some fighter's life, one was done on Evan Tanner, who was my teammate, training partner, friend. And I thought it was very good. I thought that it was very interesting the way that Evan came up. Evan was one of these guys. He had fought for a world championship and did not have a coach or a gym he was affiliated with. He was ordering DVDs online via, I think they were VHS. He was putting them in. That's how he learned. He would go grab a buddy. They'd do it right on the living room floor. And as silly as that sounds, that's kind of what we were doing out here in Oregon at Team Quest before Evan came and joined us. We had a few guys and we had a workout facility, but we had no coach. We had no instruction on a daily basis. We just had some guys. We understood that being in shape was really important. We understood that from our wrestling background. So we'd go in and just get hard workouts. We would just spar. And we were winning championships with that. Randy was the world champion. Dan was on top of the world in Japan. Matt Lindland was the #1 ranked fighter in the world. There was something to it that worked. But I did think that it was very interesting that Evan had fought for a world title coaching himself off of DVDs he'd ordered online.
Hey, Chael. So when I first started watching MMA, I remember being kind of shocked at how much blood could be in the cage and at the fact that fighters would fight on it afterwards. And so it kind of got me thinking, what was the bloodiest cage you ever fought in? What fight produced the blood that was in that cage? And how much does that affect a fighter mentally walking into a cage with blood all over the mat?
I got to tell you, I haven't the foggiest idea the answer to that question. I've seen that blood as well. And you are right, right? Somebody else's blood, somebody else's sweat in there. And you've got to walk in and you bring up a good point, but I don't know the answer to that. I could tell you the bloodiest fight I was ever in myself was Nate Marquardt. He elbowed me at some point, but it was right on the forehead, just right where it just busts open. There was blood coming there. It was in my eye. And I want to say that happened somewhat early in the contest. And I remember Clayton Hires coming in after the fight was over. And it was maybe the biggest compliment Clayton had ever given me as my trainer. But he came in the ring, there was blood everywhere and Vaseline. And what he didn't know is I broke my sternum. Broke my sternum in that fight too. But Clayton came in and he looked at me and he points at me and says, "You a tough guy." And that was all he said. But as an athlete, that was a tremendous compliment, particularly coming from him, the guy I wanted to compliment me, right? You always have that with your trainer. You want your trainer to be proud of you. And that was all he said. Pointed at me and said, "You a tough guy." And then they did the decision. I won the match. That was the bloodiest fight I was ever in. Now, here's something that you may not know, and I don't know if this is still a practice, but early in UFC, so the canvas is gray. And when blood would get on it, when they would go to commercial break, somebody would run into the ring, and wherever the blood was, they would spray paint it. They would take a spray paint can of gray spray paint and they'd put that over the blood. And that added a dynamic, though. If you ever had to smell that, or now you're on the ground and right, you can smell some of these toxins, but that was an interesting thing. So if you ever see a real bloody fight and you think, oh, okay, they must have gone in there and cleaned it. It doesn't work that way. You can't clean it out of there. That canvas absorbs. It's not a tarp. The UFC's is not a tarp. It absorbs. So there's really no way to get that blood out. They used to spray paint right over the top of it.
Hey, Chael, it's Marky Mark coming at you from Austin, Texas. I had a question regarding the athleticism that we have in the UFC. Do you think the athleticism has reached a peak, or do you think the athleticism will continue to grow as time goes on? I think that we're not quite there yet, right? Because most kids don't grow up with aspirations of becoming a fighter. They want to make the NFL, make the NBA. So I think those leagues and promotions get the best caliber of athletes. Also, who do you think is the most physically gifted athlete in UFC history? I would have to say it's Yoel Romero, just because the guy is a freak of nature. He's a specimen, right? He's an Olympic athlete, still competes at a very high level at the age of 43. I think there's also something to be said about Jon Jones, about Brock Lesnar. I'd love to hear your opinion. Thanks.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head there. I do not believe we peaked out with athleticism, but I think to your point, that athletes that aspired to go into the NFL or NHL or NBA can now aspire to come over and do mixed martial arts. I mean, we're seeing it, right? We're seeing pro athletes from other sports. Greg Hardy comes to mind, that did time in the league and are now coming over to mixed martial arts. So I do think that you bring up a good point on that, and I think that's going to continue to grow. I am not of the mind that this sport is in its infancy. I know we hear that a lot. I don't believe that. I think it's going to be a very meaningful amount of time, 10 and 20 years, before you bring somebody in that's going to make a Jon Jones look untalented, or a Conor McGregor to look untalented. I really think that the sport's at a great place. But to your point about athletes, yeah, I think that there's still some room on that. But it's definitely not where it was, say, in the 90s, or even in early 2000s. It's not. I mean, there is some of the best athletes in the world. We're seeing that. Not only guys that did time in the league, but we're seeing these former Olympians come over. And to your point about Yoel Romero, yes, if you're just talking about naturally gifted, that's a whole conversation and a whole dialogue, but Yoel is a damn good place to start.
Hey, Chael, Chad from North Carolina here. Big fan of the show. Wanted to get your opinion on something. Do you think that possibly the Jon Jones era is over? What I mean by that is he doesn't have any big compelling fights at light heavyweight. As good as Reyes and Anderson are, to the casual fan, they're not big names. I don't see those fights selling big pay-per-view numbers. And Jon's last several fights, they haven't really moved a lot of numbers and put bodies in seats. Don't see why these fights would be any different. So he could go to heavyweight, but he's gotten really quiet about calling out heavyweights lately, so maybe he's not really considering that. He's really going after Israel Adesanya. I think there's a lot of problems with that. Izzy's a weight class down, even though size isn't everything. I think Jon comes off looking like a bully. And, Israel's got so many great fights at middleweight. I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Is the Jon Jones era over? No, I don't think so. Look, you are right that a compelling match isn't necessarily out there, but what a difference a day can make. I mean, that can change very, very quickly, and I think that it already started to change. I mean, Luke Rockhold moving into 205 pounds, that would have been a very intriguing match. Chris Weidman moving to 205 pounds, that would have been a very intriguing match. I offer you those by example because those two guys weren't even in the dialogue a year ago. Now, whatever might have happened, I understand it, but to my point, that somebody can come up, somebody can come over, somebody can get a new signing. I mean, there's some interesting things that could happen, and they could happen very quickly for Jon Jones. So is his era over? No, I do think that he should do a better job in making people interested in his opponent. I think that would be a little bit more of a chess move, where if he could look forward and make people interested in his opponent. Look, don't forget, Reyes is not an easy night out. 12 guys have tried to stop Reyes, some of them world champions. Nobody's got the jump on Reyes. But that isn't what you're asking. You're asking, are people going to stop what they're doing and tune in? And I hear what you're saying. Let me give you an example. Chris Weidman versus Anderson Silva part 1. All the boys in the back had a pretty damn good idea of what was going to happen. Everybody, man, this Weidman, this is the guy. He's coming up. He's looking good. He's hungry. Anderson's been there and done that. But that was a very hard thing to sell to anyone else. Other people just go, I haven't heard of this Chris Weidman. That's Anderson Silva. Anderson's going to kick his butt. It was one of these things, and it put Anderson in a bad spot. I mean, it did, right? He's got to go out there. He's got to do some real heavy lifting. And he's not getting people as interested in that fight at the time that fight happened. Now, their rematch did mega business. But because people just had to be exposed to Chris Weidman. And I think that Jon needs to be real careful to not take his eye off Reyes. I don't think that's a real fair spot or a fun spot that Jon's in. But I would not say that the era is over. I think there's some real compelling things that could happen, but Jon could serve his own career a little bit by making people interested in the opponent, not just in him.
Hey, Chael. Love what you do, man. Quick question for you, brother. You've seen a lot of fighters going up from 185 to 205. A lot of the older guys from your generation, like the Chris Weidmans, Luke Rockholds, Jacques, and even talks of Romero going up to 205. I can't help but wonder that, is this a strategic move, maybe by the company, to put some more talent into the 205 decision, since Jon Jones doesn't really seem to have much of a dance partner nowadays. Maybe Dana had something to do with it, to say, hey, come up to 205. You have a big name. You can fight Jon Jones, perhaps the greatest fighter of all time, and make something happen. And I'll make it worth your while if you do. For sure, it's a conspiracy theory, but question is, am I crazy to think it?
I like that conspiracy. No, that is not what's happening. Dana is not going to the Weidmans and the Luke Rockholds. I think you threw out Yoel Romero and saying, hey, let's beef up 205 pounds. Give me some star power and some names, and Jon Jones is right around the corner. No, he didn't do that, but you're close. I mean, the Weidmans and the Rockholds were able to look at that division, able to see, hey, by sliding in here, I bring a lot to this division, and I could probably fast track this thing, and they were right. Luke with a win or Weidman with a win, yeah, they would have been fast tracked. They would have been right. But no, you would be wrong to think that Dana went to them with a bit of a plan ahead of time to stack things up and get somebody in there with Jon Jones. That's not the way that happened.
Hi, Chael. I know you're a huge Kevin Lee fan, and I was really impressed by his fight against Gregor Gillespie, where he scored an amazing knockout. Now, do you think that under Firhas Zahabi, Kevin Lee has a chance of climbing back to the top of the division and possibly being a contender if he gets with a few good wins under his belt?
Oh, yeah, I most certainly think that. Look, don't forget this on Kevin Lee. He's never had an easy fight. And by the way, 155 pounds is the toughest division in the sport. So you're not going to win all those fights. It's as simple as that. You're just not going to win all those fights. I thought that fight with Gregor, and don't forget, as big of a hero as Kevin is right now and as great as he looked, that fight made no sense to take. Gregor Gillespie is a killer. He's undefeated. This was in his backyard. Oh, and by the way, what are you going to get out of that? I mean, if you're Kevin Lee fought for a world championship. Kevin Lee hasn't been less than a co-main event in a meaningful period of time. He's going to walk in there and take on this undefeated guy that a lot of people didn't know about. I mean, that fight really did not make sense for Kevin. Kevin's a competitor. This guy's undefeated. He's got a ranking. Let's go do it. So I think that adds. I really do think as you're shining Kevin's wheels up, you need to also make sure that you give him his due for even taking that fight, let alone going out and getting the tremendous victory.
What's up, Uncle Chael? It's Farouk from Houston, Texas. I got 2 questions for you today, man. Number 1, do you feel like ever since you've retired from MMA, fighting-wise at least, that you've gotten more respect and admiration from other fighters? Michael Bisping came out, gave you a lot of admiration, just gave you the respect that everyone felt you were due. You know, you get interviews with fighters like no one else. TJ Dillashaw, first interview back ever since his whole incident. Kevin Lee speaks with you openly and holds you to such a high regard. You spoke with George St. Pierre, who's notorious for taking interviews maybe once every 2 years or something.
You know, I really don't know how to answer that question without coming across as arrogant. You paid me some real compliments in that question. And I will tell you that the transition from being in the ring to speaking about other guys that are going into the ring was pretty smooth. And one thing that I love about the sport is to participate. I want to be as involved as I can. And it's a very hard sport to be involved with unless you're in there wearing gloves, short pants, and you got a mouthpiece. And it's just one of those things. So, thank you. That was really a very sweet thing that you just asked me.
My dear Uncle Chael, I'm curious what you think about the UFC coming out with the absolute division or a pound-for-pound division with the champion, so we could find out who's the real pound-for-pound, who's the real, baddest mofo. We would get to a lot of dream matchups that we wouldn't get to see otherwise with all these weight restrictions. So just let me know what you think. Very curious to hear your take on it, and we love all your content. Thanks, Uncle Chael.
All right, so what are you asking? You're asking about an absolute? Now, that's a term that generally lives in grappling. So let me explain this to the viewer. In a grappling tournament, you will have, 155 pounds, and then you'll have a 170-pound division. You'll have a 185-pound division. You'll have a heavyweight division. But at the end of it, they will do what's called an absolute. All that means is anybody that had a level of success within their divisions, including 155 all the way up to heavyweight, can then enter an absolute where there's no weigh-ins or any which way you want to do it. You walk out there, shake hands, and go at it. That's a grappling term. It's a very cool thing that grappling does. Abu Dhabi recognizes an absolute. I don't think you're going to see that in MMA. I mean, don't forget, when you're talking about the blows, which you have in MMA, which you do not have in grappling, you can see where that would change things. And as far as the commissions go, no, they're not going to open the door to an absolute. There's a reason they have weigh-ins. There's a reason that they have divisions. They're not going to do that. Now, if you just want you and I to have a little fun and speculate of what would happen or what could happen, I'm your guy. I'd love to do that. But we're starting to see, I mean, even as you look at the George Masvidal, Conor McGregor dream matchup that there is right there, even Dana's looking at it going, look, these guys are in different divisions. And we're only talking about 15 pounds. We're only talking about 15 pounds keeping this dream fight from happening. So when you talk about an absolute, you're just going to let anybody go anywhere? No, not realistic.
There's no one like Uncle Chael, the man who tells one hell of a tale. You want the facts, then listen in. He's got the biggest arms in Westland. He's calling out a stack of crap. We know damn well that Tito tapped. Cause what you see is what you get, and what you don't is better yet. He's the best.